Welcome back. In this lecture, we are going to begin our study of the rise and fall of Roman law, the first episode in the story of the civil law tradition. As I said in the last lecture, Rome is essentially the birthplace of the civil law. So historians typically divide Roman legal history into four distinct periods: the Archaic period, the formative or pre-classical period, the classical period, and the post-classical period. I have dates here on the slide, but just for your reference, right? Remember, we are not going to get too hung up on the exact dates in here. We're just going to give you a general sense of timing. We will start with the Archaic period first. So let's begin with some vocabulary. One thing to know is that the Romans referred to the law that applied to Roman people, that is, the Roman citizens, as the jus civile. Now, the J sounds like a Y, jus civile. In the beginning, the jus civile was essentially customary law. Now, what is customary law, and how does it differ from other kinds of law? Well, customary law is unwritten law, an unwritten body of norms, the violation of which will subject a legal actor to legal consequences. It is established by the people and acquires its force through the repeated practice of certain behaviors. Over time, through collective repetition and acquiescence, customs acquire the force of obligation. That is, they become what we would now call binding law. One of the key characteristics of customary law is that it is unwritten. It's not written down. Now, that can be problematic. It can be difficult to know what the law is. Now, this state of unwritten law was the state of affairs in Rome for some time, but eventually this state of affairs became untenable. Why exactly? Well, you see, tension began to mount between the plebeians, the lower class, and the patricians, the aristocratic class. The patricians at this time had the power to administer law and state religious matters as well. More specifically, patrician magistrates, who were called pontiffs, were the ones who were generally responsible for the interpretation and application of the customary law. So essentially, the knowledge of what the law was and the power to administer it were limited to a handful of aristocratic pontiffs, right? They would pronounce what the law was during a dispute. Now, this led to a feeling among the plebeians that they could not be treated fairly in legal matters, and the plebeians argued that the law should be written down so that it could be accessible to everyone. Everyone could know what the law is, not just the patricians. The result of this demand is really the key legal accomplishment of the Archaic period, and that's the promulgation of the 12 Tables. In 451 BC, at the behest of the plebs, a commission of 10 citizens was charged with the task of preparing a written text of the customary law. What they came up with was a collection of rules that were set out on 12 bronze tables and displayed in the marketplace. Now, the 12 tables were primarily made up of private law. That's the law, of course, governing disputes between individual citizens, although there were some religious and public matters covered in the 12 tables as well. And within the realm of private law in the 12 tables, they were both substantive rules and rules of legal procedure. But it's important to recognize that although many matters were covered in the 12 tables, they were not considered comprehensive, right? They did not purport to contain all of the law. They contained only those points that were frequently litigated or the subject of dispute. So other sources of law were also still important during the Archaic period, including other customary law, and over time, other sources of written law. And those supplemented the 12 tables for a very long time. Now, what was the primary significance of the 12 tables for the development of the civil law tradition? Why are we talking about the 12 tables today? Well, the 12 tables are important in really three respects. One is their substantive influence on the modern civil law. Another is their written format. And a third is the manner of their interpretation. So let's talk about substance first. The substance of the 12 tables was not only important to the plebeians, but it influenced later Roman rules and in turn has even influenced some modern day civil law rules. So let's take a look at a few of the laws contained in the 12 tables. Table 4 concerns the rights of a father and of marriage. So let's look closely at Law 4 of Table 4. When a woman brings forth a son within the next 10 months after the death of her husband, he shall be born in lawful marriage and shall be the heir of his estate. So this is suggesting that if a woman's husband dies and within 10 months of his death she bears a child, then that child shall be considered the child and heir of the deceased husband and will inherit the father's estate whenever that child is born, even if it is born many months after the father's death. The 10 months here tracks the human gestational period. And so the law sensibly assumes that if a child is born within that period, then the child is indeed the biological child of the deceased husband. Now, check this out. Believe it or not, the substance of the 12 tables is still in part relevant to us today because this rule exists almost verbatim in the current Louisiana Civil Code. You can see here that Article 185 provides that the husband of the mother is presumed to be the father of the child born during the marriage or within 300 days from the date of the termination of the marriage. Now look, not all of the 12 tables substance is still relevant to us, right? Quite obviously, for example, Law 3 here has no counterpart in the Louisiana Civil Code or the modern civil law more generally. All right, so again, the 12 tables are significant in terms of their substance. Some, but not all, of what was contained within them has survived to the modern day. The 12 tables are also significant, though, because they are the first attempt at written law within the Roman legal tradition. Through their promulgation in writing, law was made accessible and comprehensible to the common man. And also, with written promulgated law comes a need for interpretation of the written word. And so we begin to see the tradition of interpretation of written law emerge in Rome. This is going to be a tradition of interpretation that we'll discuss again and again. The pontiffs, which were those magistrates we talked about a moment ago, they began to interpret the 12 tables. And when they did so, they expanded it beyond the initial letter of the law. The expansion of law through interpretation is going to be a big theme for us in this course. An example of this expansion through interpretation will probably make this clearer to you. So let's take a look at one. So take a look here at Law 2. If a father sells his son 3 times, he shall be free. What's going on here? In ancient Rome, fathers had the power to sell their sons into slavery. If the son was later set free by his master, well, he wasn't made entirely free. Instead, the son returned to the care and control of his father. This is because the son, although free of his master, was not yet free of parental authority. In ancient Rome, the head of the family, or pater familias, had absolute authority over the freedom and property of everyone in the family unit. So the son would be sold by the father to a slave master, and the slave master would set the son free, and then the son would return home, ready to be sold into slavery again. But this cycle was not without limits. You see, if the father sold his son into slavery 3 times, the son would be finally free of parental authority. Now, what went on as this early Roman society evolved is that some fathers wanted to free their sons voluntarily so their sons could begin their own families, set up their own estates. And these fathers wished to do this without actually selling their sons into slavery. So how could they do this? Well, they began to engage in a pretense, arranging pretended sales of their sons with neighbors or friends. The buyer would agree in advance to quickly free the son, and the process would be repeated multiple times in quick succession so that the sons would be free to begin their own estates. Now, when the legality of this process was questioned in court, the magistrates recognized the son's freedom despite the use of this legal pretense. They interpreted the letter of the law to allow this sort of almost fraudulent result. The use of a pretense like this to expand the law beyond its originally intended purpose, it has a name. We now refer to this as the use of a so-called legal fiction. Legal fictions, as you shall see, are found in both the modern day civil law and common law traditions. Magistrates also used interpretation to expand the law in other ways. So, for example, by applying this law to daughters. Now, by its letter, the law clearly only applies to sons. Doesn't say anything about daughters. But magistrates applied the law by analogy to daughters, thus expanding its reach. Right? A daughter is similar enough to a son that the law applying to sons can and should apply to daughters. Analogical reasoning is another way that law is expanded beyond its original scope. These interpretive methods permitted the law to evolve along with the wants and needs of Roman society. And as we'll see, analogical reasoning is a staple of legal interpretation in the civil law world today. Okay, this brings us to the end of our discussion of the Archaic period of Roman law. In the next lecture, we are going to cover the second part of the Roman law, that is the formative or pre-classical period.